Hello, friends, and welcome to the Prepwell Podcast. I'm your host, Phil Black. And if you have an 8th, 9th, or 10th grader with big aspirations, like the Ivy League, or military service academies like West Point, ROTC, or athletic scholarships, boom, you've come to the right place. My specialty, my superpower, if you will, is preparing families for these competitive programs. I'll teach you what your child should do, when they should do it, and how you can help. So stick around and prepare to out-prepare. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Prepwell Podcast. In today's episode, I want to talk about how your child's physical attributes, what we often refer to as metrics, how those metrics play into their likelihood of getting recruited to play sports in college. So if college recruitment at any level, from Division III to Division I, is not part of your child's future, this episode may not be relevant for you. If, on the other hand, you have a child in 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, or 10th grade who you think has potential to play sports in college at any level, then you'll want to stick around. Metrics refer to your child's physical attributes or measures of certain physical tasks or tests. Typical metrics that you'll hear talked about are height and weight and handedness, wingspan, vertical leap, 40-yard dash time. And sports will differ in how much weight they give to each of these metrics. For example, football happens to care a lot about weight and speed and quickness. Basketball cares more about height and length and vertical jump and explosiveness. And it doesn't take long to figure out what metrics matter most in each sport. And of course, as you move up the ladder in terms of competition, these metrics become more and more consequential. For example, a Division III soccer player's speed will not necessarily be assessed at anywhere near the precision of that of an NFL cornerback at an NFL combine, for instance. There are levels and there are levels. And at the highest levels, metrics can hold a lot of weight, and they often guide decisions worth tens of millions of dollars. We're not going to delve into the craziness of metrics at the pro and Olympic level today. Suffice it to say that they matter, and they matter a lot. Instead, I'd like to talk about how metrics might play a role in helping you guide your child on their journey to play sports in college. Let's start at the high school level. Do you need favorable metrics to play and to excel at the high school level? Not really. It helps, but it's not mandatory. Of course, it depends on the competition at your high school and what type of league you play in, but we've all seen the 5'6" point guard in basketball who breaks all the school records, or the particularly undersized football player who still has great impact on the game, or the lefty quarterback, or the slightly overweight diver. These anomalies happen on a fairly regular basis in high school sports because, as a general rule, the competition is not always at the highest level. And this gives high school athletes with suboptimal metrics opportunities to excel in high school. And they should revel in those opportunities because it might be their last run at competitive sports if they don't continue in college. The question is, what happens to those athletes after high school? Should they expect to be recruited at the college level? To the casual observer, the assumption is probably that they should. After all, they're breaking all the school records and dominating game after game. Why wouldn't a college coach recruit them? Let's move to the Division III level. Division III coaches don't normally have the luxury of recruiting for metrics, meaning athletes with strong metrics will often be recruited at the Division I level. So Division III coaches have to be careful about not wasting a lot of time chasing down these athletes only to find out that they're going to go Division I. It doesn't mean that Division III coaches don't care about metrics or that you shouldn't highlight them if you've got them during the recruiting process, but they just aren't as critical at the Division III level. Remember, Division III schools do not give athletic scholarships, so the pressure to bring in athletes with big metrics is not really there. Every once in a while, a legitimate Division I athlete with big metrics will show up on a Division III campus, and the coach and the team will be pleasantly surprised. They just can't bank on it. Division III coaches will try to recruit good student athletes who may or may not have good metrics, who might be just below the radar of the Division I level, but still want to play sports and still want sports to be an important part of their college experience. It's a whole different recruiting process compared to Division I sports. Okay, so what happens at the Division I level? Well, of course, we all know that not all Division I level programs are created equal, and the talent and the metrics of the athletes are not distributed equally. Typically, the higher level Division I coaches pay a lot more attention to metrics than do the lower Division I coaches. For example, Alabama football coaches look for offensive linemen who are 6'7", 325 pounds as freshmen in high school. Ivy League football coaches, on the other hand, even though the Ivy League is Division I, probably would not have a shot at that type of player. Those types of athletes would likely go to Alabama. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that there aren't exceptions to this rule, or for that matter, that choosing Alabama football over an Ivy League football program is the right choice. I'm sure there'd be a hotly contested debate about that. My only point here is that there are levels within Division I as well, and that gradations of metrics matter even within the Division I community. So what does this mean? Well, it means that if you think your child projects to play at the Division I level in college, or your child thinks that they'll have what it takes to play Division I sports in college, it's important to be brutally honest about their metrics. And this needs to happen early in their high school career. Do they project to be the height and weight of a Division I college football player at their position? Do they have the speed of a Division I center fielder in baseball? Do they have the length of a Division I basketball player? Do they have the 2K erg time to be a Division I rower? They don't necessarily have to embody all of those things as a ninth grader, but are they moving in that direction? Do they have the potential? Can you see them getting there? And I'm not suggesting that if they don't have the metrics or they don't project well, that you shut them down and have them take up knitting, but I do want you to be very aware of how narrow the funnel gets at the top of the Division I sports complex, so that you can manage their expectations and make course adjustments as necessary. Metrics aside for a second, in my experience, by the time a student gets to high school, if it's not abundantly clear that they're a Division I prospect, then they're probably not. I don't care how many years of club that they played, or how many all-star teams they made, or how many travel trips they made, or how good their team was, or how much time they spent with a private hitting coach. None of that matters when they hit high school. When they step foot into ninth grade and they have to compete against a bigger pool of competitors who are older and bigger and stronger than they are, you can usually get a good idea of where they stand within the first year. And you can also check in with their mindset. My rule of thumb is that if your child is not 100% set on becoming a Division I athlete by the end of ninth grade, and they don't have several coaches supporting this decision, then it's probably not going to happen. And I see this all the time in my college admissions practice. I'll have a consulting session with a student athlete in the beginning of their junior year, and I'll ask them whether they want to play Division I sports. And they will answer, "I think so if I get recruited." This is the kiss of death. This answer shows that the student has no idea what they're up against. They're under the impression that if they keep doing what they're doing, that someday a coach is just going to call them up out of the blue and start recruiting them, and then they'll decide if they want to go to college to play sports or not. In most cases, again, I'm generalizing here, this is not the way it works. Unless you are a super elite athlete, and you'll know if you are or not, most athletes must engage in a significant marketing campaign to college coaches starting in their freshman year or their sophomore year in high school. And by the way, this is the premise behind Prep Well Academy's athlete program, or I guide students through all of these steps. But I digress. Let me get back. I know there are people who are listening out there saying, but Phil, I heard about a kid who wasn't recruited until their senior year, and they still got a full ride to XYZ college. Yes, there are edge cases out there of students who fly under the radar, or they're late bloomers, or they have an incredible performance at a major recruiting event which puts them on the map. Yes, this happens, but this is not the way it normally works. Trying to get recruited to play Division I sports, even under the best conditions, is difficult to pull off. Even if you're working with someone like me, or you're enrolled in Prep Well Academy's athlete plan, even if you have great metrics, even if you have your high school and your club coaches beating the bushes for you, it's still very difficult. So pointing to a few edge cases of students who made it through against even greater odds, it doesn't really help that much. I mean, people win the lottery periodically, but is that what you want to count on to secure your financial future? Of course not. You have to do the work. The point I'm trying to make is that a lot of things have to break good for you to make this dream a reality. And if you have good metrics, it can drastically improve your chances. What other dimensions should you consider as you try to determine if your child is a legitimate prospect? Number one, the competitiveness of the sport your child plays. Basketball happens to be one of the most competitive sports out there because of the number of participants, the relative ease of participation, the popularity. So if your son or daughter plays basketball, understand that they're being compared to hundreds of thousands of other high school players, almost 1 million players between male and females. Those present tough odds, so consider the sport they play. Number two, your child's metrics. Let's stick with the basketball theme for now. Obviously, height, length, wingspan, jumping ability, general athleticism, all these things rank very high on the must-haves to get recruited to top basketball programs. The truth is, at top Division I basketball programs, if you're not at least 6'3" or 6'4", there better be a very good reason for a coach to pay attention to you. That's just the reality of college sports these days. And even if your child checks all of these boxes and they are 6'4", it's still tough to break through. You have to have a lot of other things going for you because there may be thousands, if not tens of thousands of other players just like you. And now imagine if your child doesn't have good metrics. They've got an even tougher uphill battle. Again, I'm not suggesting that it's not a battle worth pursuing. I just want to make sure that you have a reality check early on in the process. Okay, dimension number 3, do they project? This is a question that coaches ask to determine not necessarily where the athlete is now, today, but where they might be in 3 to 4 years when they get their hands on them. For example, if a basketball player is 6'6" as a freshman in high school, but skinny and long with an 84-inch wingspan, but not overly skilled, but their dad is a former basketball player who's 6'11", 260 pounds, a coach might take a bet that this player will grow into his body, will refine his skills, and grow into a promising Division I prospect. That's what it means if a coach thinks that an athlete projects well. Sometimes, if the athlete has metrics and projects well, the coach will actually ignore the player's relative lack of skills compared to their peers because the coach knows that once the athlete gets to college and trains with the team and learns their system and eats well, that the skills will come. They can coach skills, they can't coach metrics. It doesn't always work out. It's a bet, it's a risk, but it's something to consider as you're assessing your child. Would a coach project that your child has a lot of potential down the road? And why would he or she make such a claim? And the fourth dimension, are they committed? Do you think your child will be able to sustain the type of energy and enthusiasm needed for the sport for the next 3 to 4 years and beyond into college? This should not be difficult to assess. by the end of sophomore year at the latest, your child needs to be in or out. If they're not committed or they're wishy-washy, then there's a pretty good chance that any type of scholarship potential or getting recruited will likely fall away. There should be a palpable attitude that your child has about their commitment to their sport and playing in college that will carry them through the good and the bad times, because there will be plenty of both. Now, I want to shift gears and go through 2 case studies and how a parent might decide how to guide their child down this road. In my practice, I've mentored countless families on this decision. Should their child go for it or not? Should their child switch sports? Do they have the requisite metrics? Should they shift their focus from Division I to Division III sports? But for privacy reasons, I figured I'd stick with the story of my own sons and their journeys. And of course, I know their cases very well. And hopefully, as you listen, you'll be able to reflect on how your child's case compares or contrasts to my own. My 2 older sons, who are identical twins, who just graduated from high school this week, were not recruited to play sports in college. As a family, we made a very intentional decision in 9th grade that this was not going to be their path. They had other ideas in mind, but we made it clear that they were not expecting to get recruited. They did not plan on playing sports in college at the Division I, Division II, or Division III level. That was it. And keep in mind, my sons were athletes growing up. They played sports year-round. Both my wife and I were Division I athletes in college. They had pretty good metrics, at least optically. So this was not an inconsequential decision. A lot of other kids in their position may have thought that they were on the path to play sports in college or get scholarships, and that's great. My sons decided, with a little help from me, that it was not the path for them. Now, why did we make that decision? Well, let's go through the 4-step decision-making process and see how it worked out. Step number 1, how competitive were the sports they played? In 9th grade, they played 3 sports: water polo, basketball, and lacrosse. They were brand new to water polo. They were just trying it out. They were average basketball players who played rec league for 3 to 5 years, and they were relatively accomplished lacrosse players, which was their primary sport, which they had played year-round club circuit for probably 5 to 7 years. So how competitive are these sports? Well, as with most sports these days, they are very competitive. As I said earlier, basketball is at the top of the list. Water polo is much more of a niche sport than basketball, but those who excel in water polo, they start pretty young and it's hard to catch up. And lacrosse is one of the fastest growing sports around. So needless to say, they faced a lot of headwinds if they wanted to become a recruited athlete in any of these 3 sports. How about metrics and projection? Well, optically, they had good metrics for athletes. They're both about 6'4" and had relatively athletic builds. But in my opinion, they were not as athletic as they needed to be to excel in sports like basketball or lacrosse. Now, that's tough to say out loud to a 9th grader, but that's one of the themes here. You have to be honest here. You can't just make things up and just hope for the best. I'm talking about foot speed, explosiveness, vertical jump, lateral movement. These are all things that you had to do well in basketball and lacrosse, and these were not their strengths. They had many other things going for them, but raw athleticism was not necessarily one of them. If you can appreciate the distinction here, I would categorize them as good athletes, but not particularly athletic. And that stands to reason because I would put myself in that category. I played Division I basketball at Yale, which is Division I, but I would consider myself an edge case, someone who had to overcome lack of raw athleticism to get to that level. And that was a lot to ask from the twins at that point, especially since the level of athleticism required for basketball and lacrosse at the Division I level today is completely off the charts. As far as water polo goes, if that had been their primary sport for 4 or 5 years, maybe they would have had a chance. We'll never know. They're certainly better water animals than land animals. But starting in 9th grade, was probably too late unless they wanted to drop everything and pour every waking minute into water polo, which is not something they were prepared to do at the time. As an interesting aside, by the way, it turns out that one of the twins continued to play water polo for all 4 years in high school and ended up starting his junior and senior year on a very successful team. So who knows what might have happened if he switched gears in ninth grade and poured all of his energy into water polo. We'll never know. And that's the point. You have to make these hard decisions early to maximize your chances later, and it doesn't always work out. You just don't want to be in this squishy middle. So by the end of ninth grade, the twins decided that they wanted to be traditional multi-sport athletes in high school, period. They would play whatever sport was in season. In fact, they ended up playing 4 sports in high school when they added swimming to the mix. And this worked for them. They didn't have the stress of worrying about being recruited. They built great friendships on the different teams, great relationships with different coaches. They learned about how different teams worked. And I'm sure this helped them with their ultimate goal, which was to get Navy ROTC scholarships, because ROTC programs love athletes. And I suspect that being 4-sport varsity athletes at a relatively big competitive public high school probably helped them reach that goal, which they ultimately succeeded in. So in the end, even though they had decent metrics at 6'4" for an athlete and projected well with parents who were both college athletes, they decided to go in a different direction. And thankfully it worked out. The last question is commitment. How committed were they to pursuing these sports in college? Well, this was an easy one. They were not committed. They did not obsess about being recruited or getting an athletic scholarship or wanting to play at the Division I level. It just didn't resonate with them. So they played their sports to the best of their ability. They had great high school athletic careers, and they focused their efforts on landing Navy ROTC scholarships, which they figured would have more longer-term benefits. So that was that for the twins. Let's move on to case study number 2. My younger son, my third son after the twins, he and I sat down together at the end of ninth grade to have the talk. The talk is a discussion about where his life was headed, this time specifically focused on athletics. Like his older brothers, he had played lacrosse and basketball forever growing up, and he had shown a lot of promise, particularly in lacrosse, which he played year-round since second grade. He had been to the World Series of Lacrosse 2 times, blah, blah, blah. And like his brothers, he also tried out for water polo his freshman year in high school and really enjoyed it. In fact, he seemed to like water polo almost as much as he liked lacrosse and more than basketball. And now that he was in high school, it was time to make the call. What did he want to do? In his case, he decided to drop basketball altogether. For him, that was a pretty easy decision. He didn't have the time, he wasn't overly passionate about it, and he didn't think he had a lot of potential there per se. Lacrosse versus water polo was a different story. He was torn and having a very difficult time making a decision between these 2 sports. What should he do? In my opinion, this is a moment that every parent dreams of. A consequential decision that requires your experience and counsel. It's like the Super Bowl of parenting questions. What is your advice? Let's go through the questions. Question number 1, how competitive are the sports? Both water polo and lacrosse are relatively small sports compared to basketball, but they're still extremely competitive. Even though the absolute number of participants in these sports is a fraction of basketball's numbers, the players are a committed bunch, and they have very well-resourced parents and club systems who really support these programs. It would be very hard to become a recruited athlete in either of these 2 sports unless he committed now. Second question, what about metrics and projection? My younger son had promising metrics. As a 9th grader, he was about the same size as his brothers were and appeared to be significantly more athletically talented. So to be conservative, I estimated that he would reach at least 6'3" or 6'4", but had the potential to be far taller. But in which sport Was this height, if he got there, and athletic talent better leveraged as a lacrosse player or a water polo player? He also happened to be left-handed, which is a bigger deal in water polo than it is in lacrosse. And when I say a bigger deal, only because there are fewer left-handed players in water polo, so they tend to run at a premium in the eyes of coaches, much like left-handed baseball pitchers. They're more exotic because there are fewer of them. But what about his long track record of playing lacrosse for 5, 6, and 7 years compared to one season of water polo? That's a huge experience gap. It seemed crazy to give up on his primary sport based on an assumption that he would grow into a legitimate water polo player. It seemed almost irresponsible. This is when I had to break things down. And this is what you should be ready to do with your child. At the time we had this talk, at the end of 9th grade, he was about 6 feet, but he was projected to be closer to my height, which is 6'7". There's no guarantee, of course. His brother stopped at 6'4", but from what we observed, it appeared that he might be taller in the end. And if that was the case, his height would not necessarily be an advantage in lacrosse compared to water polo. How many 6'6", 6'7", 6'8" lacrosse players do you see running around? Not many. And the fact that he was left-handed made him a very rare commodity in the water polo world, but did not do much for him in lacrosse. I then asked him how much he liked water polo, and he said he liked it a lot, maybe even more than lacrosse, despite only playing for 1 year. At that point, when I heard him say that, the clouds opened up, and it was clear to me how to advise him. Because I wouldn't want to urge him to play a sport that he was built for if he didn't like it, or like his teammates, or like the vibe of the sport. But if he liked both sports equally and would have no regrets, then I would advise him to bet on the metrics all day long. Good metrics are hard to come by. A lot of them are God-given. And if your child is not optimizing them in the sport of their choice, there better be a good reason why, especially if they're trying to compete at a high level, which, as we'll find out next, is exactly what he wanted to do. And the last question is all about commitment. I asked him point blank, do you want to play either of these two sports in college at a high level? His answer was an emphatic yes. He explained that he was an athlete at heart and he wanted to push his potential as far as he could. I then asked him, okay, pick a sport. His answer was water polo. Well, that was good enough for me. So it was time to put a plan in place, which luckily we already have. It's called Prep-Well Academy Athlete. And don't get me wrong, he had and still has a long way to go, especially given his lack of experience as a water polo player. But you have to make a decision. Yes, it's risky. Yes, maybe it was the wrong decision. Yes, he's leaving a lot of lacrosse history behind, but you have to make a decision. And of course, the proof will be in the pudding. Will he actually do what it takes to get to that next level? I don't know. We'll find out in a few years. But the point here is that you have to help your child make these hard decisions at the right time. If you put them off, or you're scared of making the wrong decision, or you don't feel educated enough, you will lose the window. And every athlete and family and sport will have its own timeline. It's up to you to figure out where you are on the timeline in time. And of course, if you find yourself floundering, reach out to me and I'll try to help you out. Thankfully, my younger son's metrics have been cooperating over the last year or so. He's a sophomore. He's now 6'6". He may even have another inch or two in him. So it appears that his bet is paying off. Because from what I'm told, a 6'6", 6'7" lefty water polo player will draw more attention from coaches than a 6'6" or 6'7" lacrosse player. Now, the jury's still out. He still has 2 years to prove himself, but I think he's on the right path. Well, I shared a lot of this detail because I think the details matter. I think hearing about other families making tough decisions with limited information might give you the courage to do the same, whether it's to say no thanks to college sports or hell yeah to college sports. So far, I'm 2 for 2 in these scenarios, and who knows where my fourth son will end up. What I do know is that by the end of ninth grade or 10th grade at the latest, he and I will be sitting down to have that same conversation. So what should you be prepared to do with your athlete child? Number one, educate your child and educate yourself on how this stuff works. Do your own research, talk with other parents, schedule a consultation with me, enroll your child in Prep Well Academy Athlete Plan. Number two, have the courage to sit down with your child in 9th or 10th grade and have this tough conversation. Exactly when you need to do this will vary based on gender and sport and potential and other things, but make a decision. Number three, be honest about how competitive your child's sport is and whether or not they project to be a recruited athlete in that sport. Number four, assess their metrics. What metrics does the sport care about? And do your child's metrics line up well? And number five, gauge their commitment. Do they want this or not? And do you believe them? Plenty of kids will say, yeah, I want to get a scholarship. Yeah, I want to play in college. And then they go back to swiping on their phones and eating flaming hot Cheetos. You and I both know that this child is kidding themselves and that it will likely never happen. Their behavior will dictate over the long term, not their words. All right, let me wrap up here. And I do apologize, my voice is a little bit off today. I'm under the weather, but I'm trying to power through this because I think this is an important topic. This is not an easy time in your child's life. I am right there with you. I've been working on this with Prep Wellers for the last 6 or 7 years. I've been living and breathing this with my own sons, as you just heard, for the last 5 or 6 years in living color, right on my doorstep. And it requires you to flex your parenting muscle. I'm sure you've helped your child figure out their class schedule and how many AP classes to take so that they're challenged but not overwhelmed. This college sports conversation is similar, but in my opinion, has a lot more moving pieces and could potentially be a lot more consequential. So I think it's worth focusing on, and I wish you the best of luck working through it. And I hope this episode has helped you become better informed about how to approach it. That's all I've got for you today, folks. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for the support. If you know a parent with an 8th grader, 9th grader, 10th grader in high school that might find this helpful, please share this episode with them. You can do that by finding the small box with the tiny arrow pointing up. That's the share button. Click that button, text your friends, link to this episode, put a little note in there from you recommending that they give it a listen. If you have questions, comments, or an idea for an upcoming episode, please reach out to me by email, DM me on Instagram, check out our blog, Facebook, connect with me on LinkedIn. I would love to hear from you. Until next week, goodbye, good luck, and never stop preparing. This podcast is brought to you by Prep Well Academy. Prep Well Academy is my one-of-a-kind online mentoring program that delivers to your 9th or 10th grader a short, highly relevant video from me every week, every Sunday, in fact, where I give them a heads up about what they should be thinking about to stay ahead of the game. To get these valuable lessons into your child's hands, please head over to prepwellacademy.com and enroll your child today.